Hello everyone, today we continue our series about the War of the Third Coalition, focusing specifically on the strategic situation between Ulm and Austerlitz. The latter's battle we will hopefully discuss on December the 2nd, so on the anniversary of the same clash. As for the Battle of Ulm, you can look at the previous video I made that is titled like that. I haven't created a playlist on this series because it's really short, just 4 videos, so they figure just as single chapters on their own. And this interludium that was actually grabbed in also tactical and strategic affairs is quite important, of course, first of all because it paved the way to the climatic battle that, as you know, would conclude de facto the war and would consolidate French power and stability for the years to come. That eventually would have been, as you know, ruinous for Prussia, specifically that, as we will see today, eventually entered the campaign. That essentially was the Austrians and the Russians up to this point that had led the dances, let's say. And Austerlitz, we don't need to present, and we will naturally observe in the following video, but it's one of the single most important battles in the history of mankind, one of the greatest tactical masterpieces ever, that could have not been possible, however, if strategy had not properly brought for that clash to occur in the way it did. So it's crucial to understand also the shortcomings of the French before the battle, as not to see war as, I say, some sort of deterministic activity that we can simply measure mathematically and claiming that there is something about it that doesn't depend essentially on the moral forces involved. And definitely the French proved to be superior in that regard, but it would have not necessarily been enough per se, right? So things are made because lots of other decisions are taken, many other factors, also in fact unpredictable ones intervene, and it's always a mean to a political end, which also explains, as we will see now, the mistakes that also the Austrians, the Russians made at this point, and we have already seen in part before already. So after the surrender of General Mack, the French had basically captured up to 60,000 Austrians in during the course of the campaign, but many more were still out there. Especially the Russian reinforcements presented the greatest threat. There was still, as you know, an Italian campaign being fought by Archduke Charles. There were also some 20,000 men under Archduke John in Tyrol, and Vienna after Ulm was threatened, right? The French would eventually enter it after having crossed Bavaria and so on. So the main point for the Austrians was securing, in part, the relics of their forces to hopefully join with the Russian reinforcements and still drive away the French. It's important to realize, naturally, the moment of the decision, right, how these actions were properly calculated, and we will see it now analyzing what the alternatives fundamentally could have been. For the French, however, the campaign had only just begun, because it doesn't matter how spectacular the Ulm victory had been, and how much the Austrians had been caught off guard, and fundamentally they had surrendered an entire army without even fighting, because they were surrounded and cut off from their supply lines and so on. The the bulk of enemy forces was still out there, the Prussians were also, on alert, because the one of the French columns that had invaded Germany had actually crossed some Prussian territory that, as you know, was, especially in Germany, quite scattered here and there. For this reason, the Prussians had begun to mobilize their own forces as well, and they could make political leverage in that regard. Also, against the Austrians, against the Russians, as we've seen in this coalition, really nobody liked each other. Up to that point, Berlin had not entered the war because it had some issues with Britain over Hanover, and so this played in fact, as we were saying before, just politically an enormous role in the way that the campaign was fought, because the Prussians could mobilize and would mobilize 200,000 men, right, by early December. So this is a pretty serious thing. And speaking of months, seasons, as you know, Central European weather gets harsher in autumn, and in order to prevent the Allies to reunite, crossing these enormous distances within Central and Eastern Europe, some say also with problems of coordination due to the fact that the Russians had still the Julian calendar as opposed to the Gregorian one of the Westerners and so on. This bit just a voice, but think about the problems of coordination, right? And the and striking them, of course, meant also to advance in hostile territory towards an east that is ever less populated and productive. So creating, as we'll see, problems to the same allies as far as they were trying to reunite forces themselves in areas, as we'll see now, as Bohemia, Moravia, and so on, and maintaining them for a prolonged amount of time, and thus stretching also their own supply line. So this was particularly true for the French, as you understand, that as we will see, would take on the offensive. They maintained that pressure on the enemy with great effect, but also straining dramatically their resources. Napoleon seemed actually, after to be in the middle of a trap. In Braunau, facing him, there was Kutuzov that had arrived with his 36,000 Russians that had been definitely late for saving the Austrians at Ulm. The Austrians had joined Kutuzov with other 22,000 troops of their own. The Allied command was pretty messed up hierarchically, but let's say they had managed finally to amass enough forces to present a significant threat to the Saint Grande Armée. It had been a fight against time. This force was remarkable, but no sides locally had, say, an overwhelming strategic superiority, right? And the Allies thus had arrived late. They to save Macht, and they were saying, wait a minute, now we have to play this cleverly because we can't be defeated in detail. It's better if we reunite. General Buxhovden with 30,000 men was already in Moravia, telling you the truth. Bennigsen and another 50,000 had reached the northern borders with Austria as well. These were all Russian generals. Archduke John was the weakest of Napoleon's opponents, and we have seen still in Tyrol he had, however, 20,000 men that had been, definitely poorly spent by the Austrian command, because Tyrol was nor under any significant threat, nor was, that force reinforcing any other army, nor the Italian nor the German one. While Archduke Ferdinand was far away at this point in Bohemia, as he had managed to escape, if you remember in the previous video, the French encirclement at Ulm, and was trying to essentially reorganize, in fact, the 8,000 survivors of his army. Finally, Charles, that was the most talented military commander of the House of Habsburg. In fact, he would be one of the few ones in the future to defeat even the same Napoleon, had put an end to his inconclusive campaign in Italy, where basically the French had defeated the Austrians in detail, because the latter had opted for a sort of cordon defense that had scattered troops all over the front, and even though the French were in significant numerical inferiority, they had been much more aggressive, and understand even there where the Duke of Teschen would have derived also his name from, if he hadn't proven to be in fact a competent commander in many other ways. And in fact, now Charles was slowly ascending the valleys of Trentino, followed by an obstinate Masséna that was really on his tail. But an equally dangerous enemy threatened to enter the game. We mentioned it before. This would have tipped the balance decisively in favor of the Allies, especially if they had managed to unite in time. In fact, Frederick William III, King of Prussia, after the offense perpetrated by Bernadotte, who, as we were saying before, had crossed the Ansbach territory, violating Prussian neutrality, had ordered the mobilization of his army. So the Hohenzollern were in, and Tsar Alexander himself had gone to Berlin, in fact, and managing to convince the King of Prussia to act as, in fact, an armed mediator of some sort between the contenders, which was naturally a euphemism, as we were saying, which was hidden behind an army of 200,000 men that were ready, in fact, by early December to descend from the north on the Grande Armée, on the essentially left flank, at least of the main vector to which the French descending the Danube were advancing through. Napoleon, as I understand, was in deep trouble, right? He was squeezed between three adversaries at a time, and his army, after such a long march through Germany, certainly was not fresher than the enemy ones that had, most of which had not fought yet. So the question is, what would Napoleon do on this occasion, right? What would you have done at the end of the day? Because you will see how, as we were saying before, it was mostly the inconclusiveness, the idleness, maybe, even the awareness of certain situations, but not having the courage, the determination to act upon such knowledge that would make the difference. Von Clausewitz insists particularly on this aspect. It may be very knowledgeable, but if this knowledge essentially doesn't trigger you the necessity of moving on upon it, right? It means that either you don't know enough to stimulate this action, or you are weak. There is something that cripples you morally. So definitely the best solution would have been to anticipate the intentions of the Russians, that, as we've seen, were bringing most of the men in. Russia had sent lots of troops, given her the demographic power, to, as we've seen, essentially enter prepotently in the Central European, also Northern European scenario, and to eventually ask something in return for it. The Russians were particularly interested in Scandinavia, in fact, and the Royal Navy drew, especially after the loss of America, most of its wood for ships, for timber from those forests. So there was a great attrition here going on, and just a single battle could determine, like, how much do we need to give more to the Allies, and in exchange of what, right? So Napoleon given that the Russians were still, as we've seen, separated in different columns, would think to advance to face and defeat them, hopefully in detail, right, preventing them to reunite in time. Another idea could have been turning towards Italy while Archduke Charles was still there, right? So kind of striking yet another important front, but definitely also secondary one, where essentially giving the enemy time to unite in Central Europe and even endangering the same France, because in that sense, yes, Napoleon would have still been able to cross the Alps, but would have not definitely capable of running back to France in case of enemy invasion. So was definitely a too complicated and unnecessary option. Even less would have been to cope with Archduke John in Tyrol, that, yes, was just on the right flank of the French army, but at the same time was the least important force. The navy would be sent against this, at least preventing it from rejoining, because in part, as we will see, one option of the Allies was to defend Vienna at a point, right? And so that Tyrolese army may have been, useful in that regard, but it was just a little concern, especially given that the Allied forces had still not united again to have a decisive advantage, especially from a numerical point of view, and given that the French had superior forces qualitatively speaking. So, especially since the French could hit Kutuzov now that Buxhoevden was so far still in Moravia, this choice was definitely the best one, right? It may seem like short distances overall, but everything was calculated mathematically to just know that, at some point, if you had been chased, and as we've seen, the Russians had just like half of the speed of the French army, so they were somewhat clumsy. They would have had the worst in a chase, time-wise, and likely also on the battlefield. So the army led by Kutuzov would be Napoleon's next target, definitely. It would have not been possible to repeat with the old Russian general, by the way, the same ruse that had led to the defeat of Mack at Ulm. In 1805, Kutuzov was 60 years of age. He was an experienced military commander. He had started, interestingly enough, just like Napoleon, in the artillery, right, in the service of Catherine II, and he had continued his military career under the Tsar Paul, so the father of Alexander, and the first was the current sovereign, in the Jäger Corps, right, of which he had quickly become the commander. Now, Kutuzov's character is interesting, right? He is mostly depicted as strong, full of impetuosity, but in my opinion, he was actually quite of a calculator, rather, or at least someone who would carefully analyze his choices. He was definitely also tenacious, if anything. This is the point. He was capable of an iron determination. He was essentially a cold man. He didn't have much other, say, influences on his ideas that would, shatter him more than much. So this aspect naturally is very important. And he had especially a very important quality that made him a dangerous enemy for Napoleon. That was exactly knowing his own limits. And therefore also, paradoxically, the fact that he would never dare to compare himself to Napoleon's greatness, right? A sort of Fabius Maximus that decided, okay, Hannibal would kick our ass in open field, so I will just do something else. So this virtue, combined, as we've seen, with a solid dose of common sense, Kutuzov's had, was very rare in the Russian army at the time. And it was much kind of clumsier, you know, um, unrealistic and somewhat, in fact, also incompetent in the high command and so on. So Kutuzov in this was handling the situation the way was, appropriate, let's say. He forced the Austrian generals Merfeld and Steyr, with whom he had formed a respectable army of almost 60,000 men, to submit to his orders, so to unify command, and he prepared to face Napoleon, as we will see, in a way or another, not necessarily entailing to attack him directly, because that was one option, right? It was an option also to defend Vienna still, rejoining forces with Archduke Charles coming back from Italy and trying a battle to essentially protect the Austrian capital against the French. Vienna, however, had no strategic value, right? And especially in the broader economy of the countryside, it was necessary to supply such large armies. Yes, it could represent some sort of logistic base. It had the Danube. It was, at some point, as we will see, it was even defended by a few troops, but it was, generally speaking, lost at this point. The Schwerpunkt laid in the numbers of the allies, at the ones that they could essentially put together. Equally useless would have been to set up a sort of waterway defense along the Danube to give time for Buxhoevden alone to arrive. But Kutuzov didn't know, for example, even when Charles would have come back from Italy, nor he could face the Grande Armée alone, even awaiting for Buxhoevden, trying to buy time, and he may have gotten trapped just as Mack would have done. So those were not sensible choices at all. The most obvious one would have been to put the Danube between himself and the French, mostly, and to buy time by giving up the defense of Vienna, and thus essentially to retreat down the Danube. In fact, Kutuzov got ahead of Napoleon and undertook a strategic retreat to put the Danube between himself and the French. This was an important issue because the Russians had already crossed, and so they had to cross it back and not trying to be chased as Murat would do. In fact, the general led the pursuit of the retreating Russians, and it would turn that Kutuzov's idea was to attract the French as far as Galicia, right? Even beyond the Carpathians. So this, as you know, wouldn't happen, but it was the idea. Let's wear them out. Let's do something like, I don't know, had happened with Charles XII at the time of Peter the Great. Now, Murat did lead the pursuit of the retreating Russians, and it was very important to, of course, first of all, spot what they were doing in the first place, because there was always a screen between these forces. Murat led, as you know, the cavalry, and he could, and he would actually carry out extremely bold and daring actions, but with risk of being killed personally, first of all, as it happened many times, especially in these occasions, but in general to endanger the entire antemne, literally, of the Napoleonic army that his forces represented. At the same time, he had to realize when or where the Russians would have crossed, because that also would have essentially taken time and exposed them to the French, which Murat, in spite of his huge courage, was not really and probably cut for. In fact, Napoleon reproached him dramatically. In fact, there were bad results, and consider there were different crossings on the Danube, and also several ones that at some point we have already seen what was the clash with the Austrians for the ones around Ulm. Ney distinguished himself there because some had to be destroyed, some instead were useful for the same French crossing. And it depends on the strategic details that we have not addressed in this series. That is more like general, but we can talk about them at some point. And there was also this broader, prestige Murat had, also later on in his life, he got pretty, involved with his Neapolitan crown. He also played with the Austrians. Napoleon had to remind him that it was him who had placed him on the throne. And on this occasion, Murat was eager to enter Vienna, because that was an enormously prestigious thing. I mean, you literally seize the Austrian capital, right? But as we've seen, Vienna was just like a big center, right? Thus, a strategically irrelevant target in this situation, right? Where the enemy bases of power were elsewhere, and especially the enemy forces, the ones that you have to wipe out to succeed strategically, were. So, in the process, not only Murat lost sight of the enemy, but did not even bother to look for him. And Kutuzov, helped by Murat's rashness between the 8th and the 9th of November, in fact, managed to cross the Danube near Krems undisturbed, which definitely angered Napoleon quite a bit. In fact, when the Emperor learned of the mistake made by Murat, he appropriately addressed him by telling him that he moved like a dazed fool. And he was right. I mean, the entire point was preventing the Russians from retreating, because they had still the river to cross, and the French on their tails. What do? You waste time with Vienna. For what? Right? Napoleon himself, however, was not without fault, because in this sense he had left too much freedom to his impetuous brother-in-law, by the way. As you know, Murat was married. And even worse news, by the way, reached Napoleon at that point, exactly on November the 10th. In fact, the French fleet, the Franco-Spanish fleet, had been defeated, famously enough, on October the 21st. Just think even how relatively slowly news arrived, at least with this important degree of certainty, at the Battle of Trafalgar, that also would deserve actually a video, to say the least, if not 10 or 20, on her own. October the 21st, that was one day after the Austrian capitulation of Ulm. Just to remind you that, yes, you can achieve something, but there is always something worse that can happen in the meanwhile. So what did this mean, to make the long story short, is that now the world seas were exclusively domain of Great Britain. Just a little, political strategic note. And this was an enormous burden, to say the least, for the Emperor's ambitions, that, as we've seen, revolved fundamentally, just like the British ones, around the domination of the entire globe. And Britain and France were definitely capable of doing that by this point, like the Netherlands, Spain, etc., were on the way of the sunset in that regard. But definitely the major political and strategic cards were yet to be played in Central Europe, right? The consequences of Murat's rash action were at this point suffered by Marmont, who was marching on the north bank of the Danube. And at this point, because Murat had not essentially assessed properly the presence of the Russian forces, with his 5,000 men, Marmont found himself facing 40,000, and was saved only by the timely arrival of the reinforcement, after having lost, however, as many as 3,000 men. Now, I would like to remind you that the French in their splendid victory over the Austrians, had lost even less than 3,000 men. Right, Ulm had been less costly than this, relatively minor issue against the Austro-Russians. Murat soon redeemed himself because of this sin that evidently had pretty bloody consequences. And think about that, what you basically take on yourself as a moral burden. And he succeeded, in fact, with great personal courage in conquering an objectively vitally important bridge over the Danube in the same Vienna, returning, but only briefly, to Napoleon's good graces. On November the 15th, Murat also managed to contact the Russian rearguard, but let it slip away because the Russian general Vincent Garode agreed with him on a 6-hour truce. This was part of the Austro-Russian plan, right, to delay the French by asking them, like, do you want a truce? Like, let's negotiate. And in the meanwhile, they would take the operational time needed to slip away. And Murat even said yes. So Napoleon, learning of this, became even more furious than before, reminding his subordinate that his position did not allow him to conclude armistices like with enemy powers, and ordered him to attack immediately instead. And Murat did that because that's what he did with an enormous fury, charged, but it was too late because the Russians had already left. And these are the kind of proofs, of course, that courage and strategy are not directly proportional at all, right? Courage, just for the record, is one of the cheapest qualities in military history. I personally don't know an army historically that was not courageous enough to get themselves exterminated at some point. Being courageous has basically nothing to do with that. You have to be courageous in war, but if you're not intelligent and if you're not determinate, and you don't have also a lot of other qualities that naturally can combine in different ways, but essentially these ones, you can't really get anywhere, right? There is nothing more ridiculous to pretend that wars are won just by the most courageous. The wars are, it's fair to say, most of the times are won by the most intelligent, which is another thing. Without crossing out, of course, other moral forces that are dramatically necessary, but that are somewhat pioneered by intelligence overall. So, on November the 25th, Kutuzov with the Austro-Russians and Buxhovden with the Russians reunited at Olmütz, with the consequence now that under the joint command of Tsar Alexander I and Kaiser Francis II, there were 90,000 men. So this was just a few weeks after Ulm, and the balance of the campaign didn't look so positive for the French anymore. In fact, the soldiers of the Grande Armée in the process were showing the signs of a march that, let's stress this, had begun in summer. These forces had done essentially nothing but marching, splendidly maintaining their operational functionality, their cohesion. It had been a logistical miracle and a masterpiece of discipline, of dedication. The march across the Black Forest with French soldiers literally sleeping on their walk, right, was incredible. It's one of those passages that also von Clausewitz describes as, that if you don't understand what war means directly, like in terms of the misery, the strains, the sufferance, you can't properly get the whole thing. And the French uniforms were in tatters because after a couple of months of campaign, uniforms do not exist physically anymore. Also, their bellies were empty, by the way, because these armies were just like enormous. Nobody had ever seen them before in world history, and they consumed an enormous amount of food. We have seen this in the Farmkriege, in the chapters dedicated properly to supplies, how much it takes properly for a certain amount of troops to exhaust the local resources. And they were pushing east in poorer territories, but their forces had to remain concentrated. Naturally, the enemies had carried out an interesting amount of scorched earth strategy along their retreat. So the French mood became worse and worse, and that's quite dangerous. Also because properly an army has it cannot keep existing forever, right? It must be resupplied, replenished, and alternated. Otherwise, it will collapse. There is properly a moment of peak, and then it starts melting away. This was all a single campaign. So the pursuit of the Russians had brought Napoleon with the Garde, the 4th and the 5th Corps, and a despondent Murat in the front with his horsemen, too far from his bases in an area that is essentially between the towns of Brünn and Olmütz, and had forced him to disperse his forces to parry all possible threats. Remember, now there weren't just logistical issues, like you have to somewhat not to keep all these corps concentrated because they can create more confusion than else and exhausting more quickly the local resources. But you have now the Prussians that are mobilizing, and so you have an enemy that can virtually attack you from 3 directions, and there is only one way back for you, that is the one to France. Augereau with the 7th Corps, 12,000 men, was at Ulm, that had remained some sort of kind of base, like the first useful base on the Danube, practically, because the French had some, of course, bases on the Rhine, but they weren't they had just crossed them to get in Swabia. Ney with the 6th Corps as with 7,500 men near Innsbruck, so in Tyrol, to check any possible movement from that direction. As you see, not many forces, because that's how poorly the French considered now. And of course, the Archduke John's forces. Marmont with the 2nd Corps, 15,000 men, opposing Charles. Said Archduke Charles was definitely more dangerous at Leoben. A new corps, the 8th, that had come into play with 6,000 men, commanded by Mortier, that was stationed near Vienna, together with Davout, with the 3rd Corps of 17,000 men. Bernadotte, with the 1st Corps, 19,000, was the northernmost one, having at this point penetrated into Bohemia, north of Austria. Napoleon had thus under his direct command only 47,000 men. Right, it is true that 25,000 were ready to arrive quickly, and remember that in training, speed, logistics, that the French army was superior to the adversaries, that in the sense were not fully habituated to properly already the achievements of the French revolutionary, at this point actually imperial armies, and so they would downplay that possibility, so that Napoleon would, especially to attract them into battle, as we will see now, would show to be weaker, while actually affording through forced marches the arrival of consistent reinforcements ready for the clash. But as we were saying before, the major problem was the one that by early December, 200,000 Prussians would take the field, right? Plus other 90,000 Austrians. The Archduke Charles had mustered in Carinthia and would soon emerge from the Alpine passes and join the Allied forces. This is important because essentially Charles had bypassed the Alps in the east and managing to reach more easily, sheltered by the same massives that were between him and the French, the forces in Bohemia, in Moravia. So we're talking about a dramatic amount of forces, 350,000. So Napoleon, at this point, was unitedly in the decisive decision of the campaign. Because even though the Allies were not fully reunited, knowing especially the Prussians would join, a very consistent Austro-Russian force was concentrated and could take on the same Napoleon, and even luring him into essentially a strategic and logistical trap. Kutuzov, as we will see now, thought even that it would have been enough to just we were in November, right? So in a few weeks, the Prussians would have been there in forces, and Napoleon at that point would have had to immediately fall back, at least if he had wanted to even just to try to defeat the entire Allied array, right? But there were also, as we'll see now, some political factors for which nobody liked, for example, each other, and so especially think about the hostility between, say, Russian Prussia and Prussian Austria historically. So there was also an important pride from the Austro-Russians to prevent the Prussians to simply become the leading force also politically in the alliance. So regarding the possible options, definitely for Napoleon defending on current positions would have been useless, because he was, if he really wanted to break the enemy, he had to do it fast, right? So it would have been a clash against time, first and foremost, and idling would have just bought precious time for the Allies instead. Also, retreating to Ulm as a safe base to reduce the line of communications and reuniting. Also, by the way, the two dispersed army, receiving more easily supplies from France, would have been apparently the most logical choice, at least given the situation. But for Napoleon, it would have equated to declaring the failure of the entire campaign. So this would have nullified the entire success gained at Ulm, and just put France again on the defensive, and just posticipated another war, given that, yes, the war will probably continue in winter with less intensity, but it was just giving further time to the Allies to mobilize even more forces. So it would have been even just morally detrimental. So what Napoleon would choose was to maintain pressure on the Allies, right? Fighting against time, even more than against the enemies themselves. Well, the enemies were relaxed in that regard, because they felt like, the French are definitely in a pretty bad situation. We can't, how likely it is for Napoleon to manage to attack us with his stretched line of communications and even overwhelm our numbers. We can't play it as much as we want. And they grew confident in this, and Napoleon knew it. And this would be actually the instrument of victory for the French. In fact, this was the real picture, even just international, like how the mood and the force, the cohesion of these armies in Europe were being observed by anyone. To everyone, the Grande Armée seemed to have entered the jaws of a wolf. Literally, attacked from all sides except the French one. And this would objectively look like, as it was actually the reality to everyone involved, except to Napoleon, who knew that reality definitely can be changed, even though it takes an enormous effort, especially in this condition. But exactly, say, managing to capitalize on this kind of fatalistic, deterministic attitude that makes you only weaker and superstitious. Everybody likes to relax, but you don't really earn much by relaxing too much, especially when there is an enemy that is actually a much greater pressure and is finding all the possible ways to counter you in that sense. Indeed, the emperor believed that the conditions were finally present for him to achieve a victory that would go down in history instead. And guess what would happen? If he had had more men, he would have tried one of his kind of typical outflanking maneuvers. But now he had only just a bit over 70,000 men against this essentially more than double his force already united in Bohemia, and essentially yet almost even another more than that approaching from Prussia. So an outflanking maneuver would have meant to essentially deplete his main force further. That would have not given like a satisfactorily strong core to the entire army, and plus consider that outflanking maneuvers require naturally a greater, say, longer and kind of somewhat solid supply lines, which in this situation definitely are very difficult, if not properly impossible to have. So defending himself would have been wiser, yes, if not inevitable. Napoleon had gone too far, and too far from his bases especially, and the tenuous thread that still connected him with them was about to snap. And it can't happen if you push too much, and you can't really say know exactly in terms of that time that you would even need to carry out this plan successfully when it would have happened. So it's always a gamble. But this is exactly the point. Napoleon was convinced that he had identified the key to success, the enemy Schwerpunkt. The only factor that played against the emperor in this regard was time itself. The more time passed, the less likely his plans of forcing the Allies into a decisive battle that the enemy was trying to elude in the first place, because they thought that under their pressure the French army would have just collapsed before and therefore forced to retreat. And in his favor, while approaching the possibility of being attacked from behind by the Prussians, mobilization was close to being complete, as we've seen. So Napoleon carefully studied the conformation of terrain and identified the strong defensive position that ran along the Pratzen plateau, like located immediately west of the town of Austerlitz, a hill dominating both his main line of communication towards Vienna and his line of secondary communication, which instead passed through Brunn and Iglau. These are, by the way, all Czech names today, because at the time Bohemia was under the Habsburgs, and so German was the official name. But you know that Brunn is Brno and Iglau is Jihlava, and so on. So, so these are, by the way, all places that, as it often happens in military history, that just come randomly to become the theater of literally some of the greatest battles in the history of mankind. And the Pratzen is the key there, because around this heights, the terrain was plagued by marshes and small frozen lakes that the cold in November, in early December, was creating, and also by streams, the largest of which, the Goldbach, flowed west of the plateau parallel to it. Napoleon literally walked across these plains for days. He came to test the terrain with his own boots to properly understand what was feasible there from a tactical point of view. And this is notorious. He did this all by himself, right? And straddling the road to Brunn, between the Goldbach and its tributary, the Bosenitz, stood a hill called Zurlan, and opposite it was another small hill, the Santon. We'll see these during the battle period. In addition, many small villages, let's say, crowded the area as well. So after carrying out this meticulous reconnaissance, Napoleon ordered his officers to do the same. He chose the ground for them and said, go look at it, because that's, well, you will fight, because a great and decisive battle would soon be fought in those very places. This was on November the 21st, 1805. So as you understand, they had barely 10 days to prepare for battle and to literally learn by heart the terrain that, as you know, would be crucial. It's always a protagonist in clashes, but Napoleon calculated carefully the visuals, even the weather, when at which hour usually the mist rose. What, as you know, for all those who have read War and Peace, by the way, at least, it's very familiar, and we will see what the Grand may manage to score there. Now, the situation of the Allies, in some respect, was comparable, because, as we've seen, objectively time seemed to favor them, and it was the case. Powerful armies were arriving to help them, both from the north, the Prussians, and from the east, the Russians, further Russian troops. The entrenched camp they occupied in Olmütz provided sufficient guarantees against possible attacks as well. There was no way the French would kind of try to storm them, and, you know, spending so many precious lives of an army that was already dangerously inferior, numerically speaking. So the lines of communications with Ostrava were not threatened, and Napoleon would not have been able to do so if he had wanted to, as we have seen, due to the smallness of the troops he had under his command, the fact that he could end up surrounded himself, and that it would have been crazy just to venture in that territory without proper supplies. After all, Kutuzov suggested it would have been enough to wait a few days as well, at most a few weeks, and then the Prussians would arrive. They would have ended their mobilization. There would have not been any difficulty, for Napoleon's position would have been untenable at that point, and he would have essentially had to rush back the Danube upriver. Then the Allies could have pursued him and essentially at some point attacked him, because the overwhelming force ratio that would have gapped the distances even. So even the French advantage in speed, etc., would have been practically useful. We're talking about 350,000 versus 70,000. That's normally 3-1 is enough in military history, especially on such large strategic level, to achieve pretty interesting things without too much effort with a well-coordinated action can take the enemy out. You have 5-1. So if you look at Kutuzov's reasoning, it was kind of logical, but it still had some contraindications, if anything. First of all, the region of Olmütz, as we were saying at the beginning, would have not been able to support for much longer such a numerous army like the Allied one was, with the locally meager resources. Right, we're talking about, again, 350,000 men in areas like Bohemia, Moravia. Like it's just there is not enough. You would starve them, and consider that, of course, the bad weather was coming for everyone to worsen the situation. So there was a plan that they could have enacted, probably with some advantage. That is to say, to move their own army north, right, towards the Prussians. So in relatively richer areas where at least they could have been more easily supplied by an allied state. And so this essentially towards the northwest, across Bohemia. And this would have entailed trying to change the supply lines of the Allies, right? At least of the Austro-Russian supply lines. It would have become thus more dependent on Prussia, right? And this could be done so to also threaten more seriously also the same French ones, because at least they would have allowed the French not to move too forward east, but still they would have come closer to the to Germany fundamentally, and so to get more chances to cut in the course of the campaign even the retreat route to the French. There was even another option that was the one to the south, that is following the course of the Vltava to get between the Grand Armée and Vienna. So at least cutting one of the French supply lines in the process. This was more directly, in fact, aimed to this specific purpose, but it was more risky indeed. But it could have convinced Napoleon to withdraw his weary army westwards towards Iglau at that point. So this plan would have been, militarily speaking, more sensible. But as we know, war is a continuation of politics with other means. And the reason why the Austro-Russians wouldn't do this, in spite it would have been probably the best choice against the enemy, were stringent political reasons, which would advise a more active and enterprising conduct of operations. In fact, the Tsar had hoped that the Prussians, of course, would enter the war, because this would have strengthened the entire alliance, but Alexander was not willing to give the Prussians credit for the victory. As we've seen, Russia had acted cockily by saying, now we will arrive, we will send you all these hundreds of thousands of men, it's enormous, and then in the process we will buy credit all over Europe, and we want to master this. So the same attitude that Kutuzov had on the defeated Austrians, while Napoleon had knocked them out in Ulm and marched on Vienna. And in fact, it's the Austrian position too that, as you know, loathed the Prussians, because really they couldn't see each other. There was a sense of humiliation that the Habsburgs had gotten through this campaign that kind of sparked their own pride, like saying, in the sense, the defeat at Ulm was burning, because all those Austrians had technically not even fought before surrendering. So there was an atrocious desire to avenge it, to strike directly against the French, so to give again, to restore, if you want, the lost honor of the Austrian army. without a foreign support, and especially not like the Prussian one. And as a consequence, between Austria and Russia, a strong party was formed in favor of a speedy resumption of the advance actually against the French, that were deemed to be too weak. Napoleon looked weak, and he was acting specifically to look weak, which must compromise between the fact that, yes, you have to look weak, but you don't have to literally become, which is very complicated. It was not easy to assess properly the strength of an army at those distances and so on, but actions and negotiations are the ones that would take place were to make the thing. There were instances, the same Napoleon Parliament, right? There were French sent to the enemy camp as well to assess what like the Austro-Russians were like, and Napoleon in this also diplomatic engagement looked anxious and undecided. He was acting specifically to convince the enemy that he was done for, right? He wanted to look even physically in the apparently shattered, like a worn out man, even though he was in his prime, really. So the Allied army grew confident because, as we've seen, was at close range, was almost twice as strong as the French, and not attacking him seemed like an unjustifiable act of cowardice, as well as probably the stupidest way to miss a good opportunity to go down in history. Because just imagine it, right? Austerlitz was not a child's play. The French would lose 13% of their forces, which is not really a few. So this was really a moment to make the Austrians and the Russians require in a very important way. Also in the face of the Prussians that, as we've seen, had not spilled a single drop of blood yet, and so had all their forces well intact and even just very powerful because they operated from within the same Germany. They were just a step away, while the Russians weren't, and the Austrians had literally the French in Vienna. So looking at the choices of, at least of Napoleon at this point, definitely it would have made no sense to try to surprise the Allies by they were moving, especially were starting to move against him from Olmos. This would have done nothing but probably even pushing them back, because they had not lost kind of the idea of essentially going back east, and especially for the Russians was more desirable because they would have grown closer to their bases. Again, Kutuzov wanted to bury the French army in Galicia, literal words, but the Austrians definitely were not so interested in that evidently. And in any case, in this scenario, and for this reason, had Napoleon attacked, the Allies would have simply come back to Olmos camp, and there they would have had tried to storm it, and it would have been just a senseless bath of blood, and probably the Grand Army would have been done for. Choosing a defensive in an attrition battle on a tactically stronger position, perhaps on the same heights of Pratzen, which also dominated, as we've seen, the route of an eventual retreat towards Vienna, was an option. But through it, the French would have gained a victory, first of all, a costly victory, and therefore also posing some other strategic problems to the whole thing, because yes, the French may have won, but at which cost? And especially would have the enemies baited at that. and would have Napoleon had enough forces then to cope with the Prussians. So definitely the best option, that is the one that Napoleon had already envisaged, was to put himself in a condition of less protection, but in exactly to lure the enemy, but greater mobility, in which the French excelled, as we know, with the maneuver sur le terrière, with in this case especially with this quite speedy march that could bring in a few days consistent amount of forces to reinforce the place chosen for battle. And the best terrain on which to do this was in front of the Pratzen heights. So allowing the Allies to actually occupy them. Because even though from there, of course, they had an advantage, this was as defenders and not as attackers. And so if they had moved strategically to attack Napoleon, they would have, at that point, yes, descended, as it would be the case, from them, and feeling confident enough to somewhat not to have to cross them back again. So you understand that Napoleon's plan was to have a big victory. If he had had enough men, he could have tried, as we've seen, to outflank the Austro-Russian position. But in this condition, the best thing he could do was luring the enemy into a battle in which the French could operate on tactical terrain, what they are unable to do on an operational terrain. Which was, in fact, a great deal of the French superiority. At least, also operationally speaking, the French had proven in the Ulm phase that they were by far superior to the Austrians, to the Russians. But now they didn't have enough resources to do it. Supplies lines were too outstretched. So Napoleon's skill would have also been needed to implement such a plan, which, as we've seen, relied on essentially a great ruse, like trying to act weaker than you are, trying to act vulnerable, trying to act almost defenseless, right? Just to be attacked and then preparing a trap actually like no other. And to conclude this video, let's also analyze better the Allied plan, because from one side you have the option to play with these seemingly noxious French. Like you could try to envelop them from the south, for example, following the course of the Morava River to threaten the French lines of communication with Vienna, as we've seen. But this would expose their own lines of communications as well. And there was really not much of an alternative in that regard. Then there was the possibility of attacking Napoleon without hesitation to prevent him from retreating towards Vienna, thus shortening his supply lines, probably also avoiding some reinforcements to arrive, and so kind of just maximizing this kind of punch in a way. This, as we've seen, was exactly, however, what Napoleon wanted them to do. To perhaps capitalize even on the disorganization, on the kind of the speed of the enemy, on the carelessness. So actually the best Allied choice would be to perform a strategic outflanking from the north, rather leaning into Bohemian territory, replacing the eastern supply line with a new one from the north. But as we've seen, this would not be done because they didn't like the Prussians coming to manage basically the entire situation, and so stripping the Austrians and the Russians from the kind of the broader glory that would have derived from a French defeat. So it would appear so simple to say, okay, let's just attack. After all, the enemy is just like half our force. We'll do it ourselves without those damn Brandenburgers. This took a decision which, when putting things in motion, would immediately show how it wasn't like the simplest at all. Because staying in Olmütz would be, as we've seen, not possible anymore. Moving forward would be dangerous. So perhaps the last damage can come from an attack from the north, so that you can switch your supply lines to come from Bohemia. But again, now you have essentially to operate on your own with your entire force. And so risking a lot and also drying up further resources that, in a sense, wouldn't be enough even for the Prussians there to for reverting the tides of this all. There is also a matter of time, because you know how the thing would happen. Prussia eventually would not enter the war, or better, they would. They tried, but the Austerlitz arrived earlier, let's say, and the Prussian turn would come next, the following year. So in perspective, exactly what Napoleon wanted the Allies to do, they did. And next time, we will see exactly what that turned into. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.